remember the moment like it just happened. My name's Lisa, I'm 34, and honestly, I don't know what I was thinking. We were sitting in the living room, the TV humming softly in the background. It was one of those quiet evenings that just felt comfortable. Mark, my husband, was flipping through his phone, and I was sipping tea, my feet tucked under me on the couch. 7 years of marriage had a way of making moments like this feel normal, like nothing could shake the world we'd built together. And then I said it. It wasn't planned or premeditated. It just slipped out. One of those offhand comments you don't think twice about. We were joking around, teasing each other about silly things. Mark had just made a crack about my terrible sense of direction, and I laughed, deciding to fire back. Well, at least I can hold my own in a crisis, I said with a grin. I mean, let's be real. If something happened, you'd be too weak to protect me. The second the words left my mouth, I saw something shift in him. It was subtle, a flicker in his eyes, the way his hand paused mid-scroll. I thought he'd laugh, brush it off like he usually did when I teased him. But instead, he just looked at me for a moment, his expression unreadable. I could feel the silence settle between us, heavier than I'd expected. "What's that supposed to mean?" he asked finally, his voice calm but firm. I laughed awkwardly, trying to lighten the mood. "Oh, come on, Mark, it's just a joke. You know I don't mean it." But he didn't smile. He just set his phone down and leaned back in his chair, his gaze fixed on me in a way that made me squirm. "You really think that?" I felt a twinge of guilt, but brushed it aside, waving my hand dismissively. "Of course not. Don't be so serious. You know I love you." He didn't say anything, and the silence stretched longer this time. I could feel my chest tighten, but I told myself it was fine. Mark wasn't the type to hold grudges or get upset over little things. This would blow over, just like it always did. At least that's what I thought. The rest of the evening passed quietly. Too quietly. Mark barely spoke, and I told myself he was just tired. I didn't want to press him, didn't want to admit that maybe I'd gone too far. So, I went to bed early, hoping things would be back to normal in the morning. But when I woke up, he wasn't there. At first I thought he'd just gone out for a run. Mark liked to clear his head that way sometimes. But as the hours passed and there was no sign of him, a sinking feeling began to creep in. I checked my phone, but there were no messages, no missed calls. I wandered through the house, my heart pounding as I noticed little things missing. His gym bag, a couple of shirts from the closet, his toothbrush. I tried calling him, but it went straight to voicemail. Panic started to set in as I replayed our conversation from the night before. Had I really upset him that much? It was just a joke. How could something so small cause this? By the time evening rolled around, I was a wreck. I called his brother, hoping for some kind of explanation, but all he said was, "Mark's here. He just needs some space." Some space. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. In all the years we'd been together, Mark had never done anything like this. Sure, we'd had our arguments, our rough patches, but he'd always been the steady one, the one who stuck it out no matter what. And now, he was gone. I sat on the couch, staring at the spot where he'd been the night before, trying to make sense of it all. Was it really about the joke? Or was there something deeper, something I hadn't seen? The more I thought about it, the more I realized how blind I'd been. Mark had always been quiet, steady, the kind of person who didn't complain or make a fuss. I'd always assumed that meant he was fine, that he didn't need the same kind of reassurance or validation that I did. But maybe I was wrong. Maybe he'd been carrying things I hadn't noticed, and my stupid comment had been the breaking point. I wanted to call him, to apologize, to beg him to come home. But I didn't know what to say. What if I made things worse? What if he didn't want to hear from me? The fear of rejection kept me frozen, staring at my phone but unable to press the call button. The hours dragged on, and the house felt emptier than it ever had before. Every sound, every shadow seemed to remind me of him, of the life we'd built together. And for the first time in years, I felt truly alone. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I couldn't help but wonder, had I just lost the best thing in my life because of one careless joke? Or was this a wake-up call, a chance to see the cracks in our relationship before it was too late? I didn't know the answer, but one thing was certain. I couldn't ignore it anymore. My first instinct was to reach for my phone, hoping for a message, something to give me a sign that this was all temporary. But the screen was blank, save for the usual notifications. Mark hadn't called, hadn't texted, hadn't even left a note. I shuffled into the kitchen, barely aware of my movements. The coffee I made tasted bitter, but I drank it anyway, hoping it would jolt me into clarity. My mind was a haze of questions, regrets, and worst-case scenarios. Why did he leave without telling me? Was he really at his brother's? Or was that just a polite lie to keep me at bay? And the most haunting thought of all, was he coming back? I found myself wandering through the house, drawn to the little things he'd left behind. His slippers were still by the bed, his favorite mug sat untouched in the cabinet, and his jacket hung on the back of the chair like he'd be home any minute to grab it. But the absence of his presence was glaring. The spaces he usually filled, his spot on the couch, the corner of the bathroom counter where he kept his shaving kit, felt like gaping voids. I replayed the conversation from the night before 100 times in my mind, dissecting every word, every inflection, every moment. At first, I told myself it was just a joke, that he was overreacting. But the more I thought about it, the more I began to see it differently. I'd dismissed his feelings so casually, brushed off his reaction like it didn't matter. And that wasn't the first time. I thought back to all the little jabs, the teasing comments I'd made over the years. They'd seemed harmless to me, funny, even. But maybe they weren't. Maybe they'd been chipping away at something I hadn't realized. Mark wasn't the type to complain or fight back. He was steady, reliable, the kind of person who held everything inside. I'd taken that steadiness for granted, assumed it meant he was unshakable. But what if it had been a mask? By midday, my anxiety had reached a breaking point. I called Mark's brother again, hoping for more information, but his response was short and clipped. "He's okay, Lisa. He just needs some time. Give him that." Time. It felt like the cruelest punishment, this waiting, this not knowing. I wanted to drive over there, to demand answers, but I knew that would only push him further away. Instead, I sat on the couch and stared at the ceiling, letting the weight of my own guilt sink in. The house grew darker as the day turned to evening, and still, there was no word from Mark. I thought about calling one of my friends, but the idea of explaining what had happened made my stomach turn. How could I admit that I'd hurt him so deeply with something so stupid? How could I make them understand when I barely understood it myself? It wasn't until I was cleaning up the kitchen that I found the letter. It was tucked under the edge of the fruit bowl, a single sheet of paper folded in half. My heart raced as I picked it up, recognizing Mark's handwriting immediately. "Lisa, I need some space." Last night wasn't about the joke. It was about everything it made me realize. For years, I felt like I wasn't enough for you. You make jokes, and I laugh them off, but deep down, they've made me question myself. I've tried to be the steady one, the strong one, but I can't keep pretending it doesn't hurt. I need time to figure out who I am, apart from who I've been trying to be for you. Please don't call me right now. I'll reach out when I'm ready. Mark. I read the letter 3 times before it really sank in. This wasn't just about last night. It was about years of unspoken feelings, of wounds I hadn't even realized I was inflicting. Mark had been carrying this weight alone, and my careless words had been the breaking point. I sank into the chair, clutching the letter in my hands as tears streamed down my face. The realization was like a punch to the gut. I'd been blind to his pain, too caught up in my own insecurities to see his. I thought back to all the times I'd brushed off his feelings, assuming he didn't need the same kind of validation I did. I'd taken his silence for strength, his steadiness for indifference. That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind was a storm of memories, regrets, and questions. I thought about the early days of our relationship, when everything had felt so effortless, so full of joy. We'd been a team, partners in every sense of the word. But somewhere along the way, I'd stopped seeing him as my equal. I'd started treating him like a fixture in my life, someone who would always be there no matter what. As the hours ticked by, I realized something had to change. This wasn't just about Mark. It was about me, about the way I'd let my own fears and insecurities shape our relationship. I'd used humor as a shield, a way to deflect from my own vulnerability, and in doing so, I'd hurt the person I loved most in the world. I grabbed a notebook and started writing. I didn't know if I'd ever show it to Mark, but I needed to put my thoughts into words. I wrote about the moment I fell in love with him, about the ways he'd supported me, about all the little things I'd taken for granted. And then I wrote about my fears, of losing him, of not being enough for him, of failing to be the partner he deserved. By the time I finished, the first light of dawn was creeping through the windows. I set the notebook aside and sat in the quiet, letting the weight of everything settle over me. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't going to give up on us, not without a fight. The next few days passed in a blur of routine and restlessness. I went to work, made dinner, cleaned the house, anything, to keep myself occupied, to avoid the unbearable silence that greeted me every time I walked through the door. But no matter what I did, Mark was always in the back of my mind. I checked my phone obsessively, hoping for a text, a missed call, anything that would tell me he was ready to talk. But there was nothing. I found myself replaying the letter over and over in my head, dissecting every word, every line, trying to read between them for some hidden meaning. He said he needed space, and I wanted to respect that. But the not knowing was eating me alive. Was he angry? Hurt? Did he miss me at all? Or was he realizing that life without me might be easier? On the 4th day, I finally broke down and called a close friend, Megan. She'd known Mark and me since the beginning, and if anyone could help me make sense of this, it was her. I messed up, I blurted the moment she answered. What happened? She asked, her voice immediately concerned. I explained everything. The joke, his reaction, the letter. Megan listened quietly, letting me pour it all out without interrupting. When I finally finished, there was a long pause on her end. Lisa, she said carefully, do you think it's really just about the joke? Her question caught me off guard. What do you mean? I mean, it sounds like Mark's been feeling this way for a long time. Maybe the joke was just the final straw. I sighed, rubbing my temples. I know. I've been thinking about that too. And I hate that I didn't see it sooner. I hate that it took this for me to realize how much I've hurt him. Megan's voice softened. Look, I'm not saying this is all on you. Relationships are complicated, and it sounds like Mark has his own stuff to work through. But if you want to fix this, you're going to have to be honest, with him and with yourself. Honest. The word lingered in my mind long after we hung up. How honest had I been, really? I'd spent so much time deflecting, joking, avoiding the deeper issues because they scared me. And now here I was, facing the consequences of that avoidance head-on. That evening, I sat down with the notebook I'd started and began writing, again. This time, I didn't just write about my feelings. I wrote about the patterns I'd noticed, the ways I'd let fear and insecurity shape my behavior. I wrote about the moments I'd dismissed Mark's emotions, the times I'd prioritized, being right over being kind. It was painful to confront, but I knew it was necessary. Halfway through, I remembered something Mark had once said during an argument early in our marriage. "You don't have to be perfect," he'd told me. "I just need you to be real with me." Real. That word struck a chord deep within me. Had I ever truly let myself be vulnerable with Mark? Or had I been so busy trying to protect myself that I'd forgotten how to let him in? As I wrote, I realized how much I'd been holding back, not just from Mark, but from myself. I'd always prided myself on being strong, independent, someone who didn't need anyone else to make her happy. But the truth was, I did need Mark. I needed him more than I wanted to admit, and that scared me. Because needing someone meant risking the possibility of losing them. By the time I put the pen down, I felt both drained and strangely lighter. For the first time in days, I allowed myself to hope. Maybe this wasn't the end. Maybe it was a chance to start over, to rebuild our relationship on a stronger foundation. The next morning, I decided to reach out to Mark's brother. I knew Mark had asked for space, but I needed to at least let him know I was ready to talk whenever he was. "Hey," I said when his brother picked up. I don't want to overstep, but could you tell Mark that I'm here when he's ready? I don't want to pressure him, but I want him to know that I'm not giving up on us." There was a pause on the other end, and then his brother said, "I'll let him know." It wasn't much, but it was enough to give me a sliver of hope. Over the next few days, I threw myself into self-reflection. I started researching ways to improve communication in relationships, watching videos, reading articles, anything that might help me understand where I'd gone wrong and how I could do better. I even made an appointment with a therapist, something I'd been avoiding for years. It wasn't easy. There were moments when I wanted to give up, when the fear of losing Mark felt too overwhelming to bear. But every time I felt that way, I reminded myself why I was doing this. I wasn't just fighting for him. I was fighting for us, for the life we'd built together, and the future we could still have. And then, on the 7th day, my phone buzzed. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding as I saw Mark's name. For a moment, I was too afraid to open the message, terrified of what it might say. But finally, I took a deep breath and tapped on it. "Can we meet? I think it's time we talked." The relief that washed over me was almost overwhelming. I didn't know what would happen next, but I knew one thing for sure. I was ready to face whatever came, as long as it meant fighting for the man I loved. We agreed to meet at a small park not far from our house, a quiet place where we used to take walks in the early days of our relationship. It was neutral ground, familiar, but not too close to the home that now felt like a ghost of what we once had. I arrived early, my stomach in knots, and found a bench near the pond. The January chill hung in the air, and I could see my breath as I sat there, waiting. I clutched my coat tighter around me, my mind racing through every possible scenario. What would he say? What should I say? The minutes stretched, and every passing second felt heavier than the last. When Mark finally appeared, I felt my heart leap and sink all at once. He looked tired, his face shadowed with stubble, his shoulders hunched like he was carrying the weight of the world. He spotted me, hesitated for a moment, then made his way over. "Hi," he said, his voice soft, almost hesitant. "Hi." We stood there for a moment, the tension between us palpable. Finally, he gestured toward the bench, and we sat down, leaving a careful distance between us. Neither of us spoke at first. The silence was deafening, broken only by the distant sound of ducks on the pond and the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. I opened my mouth to say something, anything, but the words caught in my throat. Mark was the first to break the silence. "I'm sorry for leaving like that. It wasn't fair to you." I shook my head quickly. "No, don't. You had every right to leave, Mark. My voice cracked, and I took a deep breath to steady myself. "I'm the one who should be apologizing. I hurt you, and I didn't even realize how much until it was too late." He looked down at his hands, his fingers twisting together. "It wasn't just the joke, Lisa. It was everything that came before it. All those little moments when I felt less than. I kept telling myself it didn't matter, that I could handle it, but I guess I couldn't." Hearing him say those words felt like a knife to the heart. "I know," I said quietly. "I see that now. And I hate that I didn't see it sooner. I've been so caught up in my own fears, my own insecurities, that I didn't stop to think about how they might be affecting you." He looked at me then, his eyes filled with a mix of sadness and something else. Maybe hope. "What fears?" I hesitated, my instinct to deflect kicking in. But then I remembered what he'd said in his letter, about needing me to be real with him. "I've always been afraid of needing someone too much," I admitted. "Of losing myself in a relationship. So I put up walls, made jokes, kept things on the surface. But in doing that, I pushed you away. I made you feel like you weren't enough, when the truth is, you're more than enough, Mark. You've always been more than enough." He didn't say anything for a moment, just stared at me like he was trying to decide if he could believe my words. "Do you mean that?" "Yes," I said, my voice steady. "I mean it. And I know words aren't enough. I know I have to show you, to prove that I can be the partner you deserve." Mark sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I don't need you to be perfect, Lisa. I've never needed that. I just need to know that we're in this together, that we can talk to each other without feeling like we have to hold back." I nodded, tears stinging my eyes. "We are. I promise, we are. I've been doing a lot of thinking these past few days, and I've realized so much about myself and about us. I don't want to keep making the same mistakes. I want to be better for you, for us." For the first time since he'd arrived, a faint smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. "Whatever it takes, however long it takes, I'm all in." He looked at me for a long moment, then reached out and took my hand in his. His touch was hesitant at first, as if he was afraid I might pull away. But when I didn't, he gave my hand a gentle squeeze. "Then let's try," he said. "Let's figure this out. Together." Relief washed over me, mingling with a cautious hope. I knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, that we'd have to work through the hurt and rebuild the trust we'd lost. But for the first time in what felt like forever, I believed we could do it. We sat there for a while longer, our hands intertwined, watching the sun dip lower in the sky. The park around us was quiet, peaceful, as if the world had paused just for us. And in that moment, I knew we'd taken the first step toward finding our way back to each other. In the days that followed our conversation at the park, things between Mark and me were tentative, like walking on a bridge still under construction. We spoke cautiously, testing the waters, and every word carried weight. I could feel the fragility of our connection, but it wasn't emptiness. It was something raw, something unpolished, and for the first time, something real. We started small. A morning text from him. Good luck at work today. A voicemail from me. Just checking in. No. Pressure to call back. These little exchanges, however brief, began to weave a thread between us. It wasn't the old fabric of our relationship. It was something entirely new, and I wasn't sure where it would lead. A week later, Mark suggested meeting for coffee. When I arrived at the cafe, I saw him sitting by the window, stirring a cup of black coffee. He looked up as I approached, and though he gave me a small smile, I could see the guardedness in his eyes. "Hey," I said, sliding into the seat across from him. "Hey." For a moment, we sat in silence, the awkwardness palpable. The clinking of cups and low hum of conversation around us felt louder than it should. Finally, Mark broke the ice. "So, how have you been?" The question felt loaded, but I answered honestly. "I've been doing a lot of thinking. About us, about myself, and I've been seeing a therapist. I thought it might help me understand things better." He blinked, surprised. "A therapist?" I nodded. "Yeah, it's something I should have done a long time ago, but I was too scared to face my own stuff. I didn't want to admit I needed help." Mark leaned back, studying me. "What made you decide to do it now?" I hesitated, then met his gaze. "You. Losing you, even for a little while, made me realize how much I've been avoiding. Not just with you, but with myself. I've been hiding behind jokes and deflection because it's easier than being vulnerable. But I don't want to do that anymore." His expression softened, though I could still see the caution in his eyes. "That's a big step, Lisa." "It is," I agreed. "And I know it's not enough to just say I'm working on myself. I need to show you, and I'm ready to do that. I hope you'll be patient with me while I figure it out." He looked down at his coffee, his fingers tracing the edge of the cup. "I'm not looking for perfection, Lisa. I just want honesty. If we're going to try again, I need to know that we're both in this for real. No more pretending things are fine when they're not. No more sweeping things under the rug." "Agreed," I said firmly. "No more rugs." He laughed softly at that, and for the first time in weeks, I saw a glimpse of the man I'd fallen in love with. The sound warmed something in me, a fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, we could find our way back to each other. As we continued talking, the conversation turned to lighter topics, work, mutual friends, even a few memories of better times. It wasn't easy, and there were moments when the weight of everything unsaid threatened to pull us under. But we kept going, step by cautious step. Over the next few weeks, we began seeing each other more regularly. We took walks, went out for dinner, and even started cooking together again, a small ritual that had once been a cornerstone of our relationship. It was like learning to dance all over again, awkward and uncertain, but with a shared determination to find the rhythm. One evening, as we stood side by side in the kitchen chopping vegetables, Mark paused and looked at me. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "That night, when you made the joke about me being too weak to protect you, what were you really feeling?" His question caught me off guard, and I put the knife down, turning to face him. "I was scared," I admitted. "Not of you, but of what I felt when I saw you struggling. I didn't know how to deal with it, so I made a joke. It was stupid and thoughtless. And I'm so sorry, Mark. You deserved better than that." He nodded slowly, his eyes searching mine. "I get it. I think I've been scared too. If anything, I've failed you by not seeing how much you were carrying on your own. I want to change that, Mark. I want us to carry it together." He reached out then, his hand brushing against mine. "I want that too." In that moment, I felt something shift between us. It wasn't a grand, sweeping resolution. It was quiet, tentative, and profoundly meaningful. We weren't healed, not yet, but we were healing. Together. As the days turned into weeks, we continued to rebuild our relationship, brick by brick. There were setbacks and tough conversations, but we faced them head-on, determined to grow stronger through the struggles. For the first time, we were learning to truly see each other, not as perfect, not as infallible, but as two flawed, deeply human people trying to make it work. One night, as we lay in bed, Mark turned to me and said, "You?" "No, Lisa, I think this might be the hardest thing we've ever done." I smiled, taking his hand in mine. "Hard, but worth it." He nodded, a small, genuine smile on his face. "Definitely worth it." Months passed, and life began to settle into a new rhythm. It wasn't the same as before. It couldn't be, and I didn't want it to be. What Mark and I were building now felt deeper, more intentional. Every step we took toward each other felt earned, and that made it all the more valuable. One of the biggest changes was how we communicated. Gone were the days of brushing off difficult conversations with humor or avoiding them altogether. Instead, we leaned into the discomfort, facing it head-on. It wasn't easy. There were moments when my old habits of deflection clawed their way to the surface, but I caught myself, and Mark was patient as I worked through it. We began going to couples therapy, something neither of us had ever considered before. At first, I was nervous, unsure of how it would feel to air our struggles in front of a stranger. But our therapist was kind, insightful, and helped us navigate conversations we hadn't been able to have on our own. One session, Mark shared something that took my breath away. "I think a part of me has always felt like I needed to prove myself to Lisa," he said. "Like I had to earn her respect by being strong, by never showing weakness. But I've realized that's not what love is about. I don't want to be her hero. I just want to be her partner." His words hit me like a freight train. I hadn't realized how much I'd contributed to that dynamic, how my own fears and insecurities had fed into his need to prove himself. "You've always been enough, Mark," I said, my voice trembling. "I'm so sorry I ever made you feel otherwise. You don't have to prove anything to me. I just want you to be you." Therapy wasn't a magic fix, but it gave us tools we desperately needed. We learned how to listen to each other without judgment, how to express our feelings without fear of rejection. Slowly but surely, we began to heal the wounds we'd both carried for so long. Outside of therapy, we focused on rediscovering the joy in our relationship. We started setting aside time for weekly date nights, sometimes as simple as a walk through the park, other times a movie or dinner at our favorite restaurant. We laughed more, talked more, and found ourselves reconnecting in ways that felt natural and easy. One Saturday afternoon, Mark suggested we go back to the trail where we'd had our infamous hike, the one that had sparked the joke and everything that followed. At first I was hesitant. The memory of that day still carried a sting, but I realized it could also be an opportunity to rewrite the narrative. The hike was challenging, as it had been before, but this time, we approached it differently. We took our time, stopping frequently to rest and admire the scenery. When we reached the steep incline that had caused so much trouble the last time, I paused and looked at Mark. "We've got this," I said, offering him my hand. He smiled and took it. Together. We climbed the hill slowly, deliberately, and when we reached the top, the view was breathtaking. We stood there for a long time, hand in hand, taking it all in. It wasn't just the view that left me in awe. It was the realization of how far we'd come, both literally and figuratively. As we made our way back down the trail, Mark turned to me and said, "You know, I never thought I'd say this, but I'm glad we went through all of this. It was painful, but it forced us to face things we'd been ignoring for years." I nodded. understanding exactly what he meant. Me too. It's strange, isn't it? How something so hard can lead to something so beautiful. He stopped walking and pulled me into a hug. "You're beautiful," he said, his voice soft, "even when you're sweaty and covered in dirt." I laughed, swatting his arm. "You really know how to charm a girl." By the time we got back to the car, I felt lighter than I had in months. The weight of everything we'd been through was still there, but it was no longer crushing. It was a part of us now, a reminder of our resilience and our commitment to each other. Over time, the memory of the joke that had set everything in motion faded into the background. It wasn't forgotten, but it no longer held power over us. Instead, it became a symbol of how far we'd come. A reminder that even in our darkest moments, there was a way forward. One evening, as we sat on the couch watching a movie, Mark turned to me and said, "I'm proud of us, Lisa, for not giving up." I smiled, leaning my head against his shoulder. Me too. We weren't perfect, and we never would be. But we were stronger, wiser, and more connected than we'd ever been. And for the first time in a long time, I felt truly at peace. The seasons turned, and with them came a sense of renewal. Spring was in full bloom, and life felt lighter, brighter. Mark and I had found a rhythm, an equilibrium that felt solid, yet alive, always evolving. We weren't just rebuilding. We were thriving in ways I hadn't imagined possible when he'd walked out that night. But life has a way of testing you when you think you finally got it all figured out. It happened on an ordinary Friday evening. We were preparing dinner together, the kitchen filled with the warm aroma of garlic and roasted vegetables. I was slicing bread when my phone buzzed on the counter. I glanced at the screen and froze. It was a message from my older sister, Chloe. The words were simple but carried a weight that hit me like a freight train. "Call me when you can. It's about Dad." Mark noticed my sudden stillness. "What's wrong?" I handed him the phone, unable to speak. He read the message, his brow furrowing. "Call her," he said gently. I nodded, my hands trembling as I picked up the phone. Chloe answered on the first ring. "Lisa," she said, her voice tight with worry. "Dad's in the hospital. It's his heart. They're running tests, but it's serious." The world seemed to tilt beneath me. My relationship with my father had always been complicated, years of unspoken tension and unresolved wounds, but the thought of losing him was a punch to the gut. "I'll be there," I said, my voice shaking. Mark was already moving, putting the knife down and wrapping, his arms around me. "We'll go together," he said firmly. That night, as we drove to the hospital, I couldn't stop the flood of memories, some good, some painful. My father's booming laughter, his sharp criticisms, the way he'd always seemed larger than life. I realized, with a pang of guilt, how much I'd taken for granted. At the hospital, Chloe met us in the waiting room, her face pale and drawn. "He's stable for now," she said, her voice trembling. "But they're monitoring him closely." Mark stayed by my side, his presence a steady anchor as we waited for updates. When the doctor finally came out, the news was cautiously optimistic. My father had suffered a mild heart attack, but with treatment and lifestyle changes, he had a good chance of recovery. In the days that followed, I spent hours at the hospital, sitting by my father's bedside. It was awkward at first. He wasn't a man used to showing vulnerability, and I wasn't sure how to bridge the gap between us. But as the days turned into weeks, something shifted. One afternoon, as I sat peeling an orange for him, he looked at me and said, "You're a lot like your mother, you know." I paused, startled by the unexpected comment. "Really?" He nodded, a faint smile on his lips. Strong-willed, independent, but sometimes a little too quick to push people away. His words stung, not because they were cruel, but because they were true. "I'm working on that," I said softly. He nodded again, his expression thoughtful. "Good. It's worth it." As my father recovered, I found myself reflecting on the parallels between my relationship with him and my relationship with Mark. Both had been marked by unspoken expectations and missed opportunities for connection. But unlike with my father, I still had time with Mark to get it right. One evening, after visiting the hospital, I came home to find Mark sitting on the couch, a stack of old photo albums spread out in front of him. "What's all this?" I asked, curious. He looked up, a sheepish smile on his face. "I figured it might be nice to take a trip down memory lane, remind ourselves of the good times." I sat down beside him, and together we flipped through the albums, laughing at the awkward haircuts, silly poses, and cherished moments captured on film. It was a reminder of how far we'd come, and how much we'd built together. As we closed the last album, Mark turned to me and said, "You've been amazing these past few weeks, Lisa. Watching you with your dad. It's made me love you even more." Tears welled in my eyes. "I couldn't have done it without you, Mark. You've been my rock." He pulled me into his arms, holding me close. "We're each other's rock," he said. "That's what this is all about." In that moment, I realized how much we'd grown, not just as individuals, but as partners. We'd faced challenges, confronted our fears, and come out stronger on the other side. Life wasn't perfect. It never would be. But it was beautiful in its imperfections. And as I sat there with Mark, I knew we were ready to face whatever came next, together. As the weeks turned into months, the momentum of life began to steady again. My father was released from the hospital, weaker but determined to make the changes necessary for his recovery. Mark and I supported him however we could, helping with errands, attending doctor appointments, and just being present. It was an odd shift in our dynamic, especially given the emotional distance I'd always maintained with my dad. But this time, I wasn't running. I was staying, even when it hurt. Mark was my constant. He never imposed or pushed, but was always there when I needed him. Watching him interact with my father was a revelation. He brought a quiet strength to those moments, a reassurance that seemed to ease my dad in a way I couldn't. One evening, after we'd dropped my father off at his house, Mark turned to me in the car. "You know," he said, breaking the comfortable silence, "I think your dad is proud of you. He might not say it outright, but you can see it in the way he looks at you." The words stirred something deep in me. "You think so?" "I know." "So," Mark replied with certainty. His belief in me gave me the courage to believe it myself. Around this time, Mark and I started talking about the future, what we wanted, where we saw ourselves in 5, 10, even 20 years. It was the kind of conversation we'd avoided in the past, perhaps out of fear that our visions wouldn't align. But now, it felt natural. We talked about everything, traveling to places we'd only dreamed of, trying new hobbies, and even the idea of starting a family someday. It was exciting, but also grounding, a reminder that we were building something together, not just living parallel lives. But as much as things were improving between us, there were still moments of tension. One night, after a particularly long day at work, I came home feeling irritable and exhausted. Mark had planned a nice dinner, but I snapped at him over something trivial. "I just need some space right now, okay?" I said sharply, immediately regretting my tone. Mark's expression shifted, hurt flashing across his face before he masked it. "Of course," he said quietly, stepping back. I spent the next hour, sitting alone in the bedroom, stewing in guilt. Eventually, I got up, walked into the living room, and found him sitting on the couch reading. "Mark," I began, my voice hesitant. He looked up, his expression neutral. "Yeah?" "I'm sorry," I said, sitting down beside him. "That wasn't fair of me. You didn't deserve that." His shoulders relaxed and he set the book aside. "I get it, Lisa. Everyone has bad days. But you don't have to push me away when you're feeling overwhelmed. Let me be there for you." His words hit me with their simple truth. "I'm trying," I admitted. "Old habits die hard." He reached for my hand. "I know. And I see the effort you're putting in. That means a lot to me." Moments like these reminded me that progress wasn't linear. Healing wasn't about never making mistakes. It was about learning from them and doing better the next time. One Saturday morning, as we sat on the porch sipping coffee, Mark said, "Do you ever think about that hike?" The question caught me off guard. "Which one?" "You know," he said with a wry smile. "The one that started all of this." I chuckled, shaking my head. How could I forget? He leaned back in his chair, his gaze thoughtful. "I think about it sometimes, not in a bad way. More like it was the moment everything shifted. Like we hit rock bottom, and then we started climbing back up." I nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. It was painful, but it brought us here, and I wouldn't trade where we are now for anything. He reached across the small table, his hand covering mine. "Me neither." That day, we decided to revisit the trail again. This time, we invited my dad to join us. He was hesitant at first, but eventually agreed, eager to test his limits after weeks of recovery. The hike was different from any of the ones we'd done before. It wasn't just about us anymore. It was about bringing my father into a space that had become sacred to us. We walked slowly, stopping frequently to let my dad rest. Mark carried extra water bottles in his pack, always anticipating what we might need. When we reached the steep incline, my father hesitated, looking up at the path ahead. "Take your time," Mark said, stepping beside him. "We'll do it together." And we did, step by step. With Mark's steady encouragement and my dad's determination, we reached the top. The view felt more profound than ever, not because of the scenery, but because of the journey it represented. As we stood there, my father turned to me and said, "You're stronger than I ever gave you credit for." The words caught me off guard, and for a moment, I couldn't speak. When I finally managed to respond, all I could say was, "Thank you, Dad." On the way down, Mark and I walked a few steps behind my father, who seemed more at peace than I'd seen him in years. "I think he needed this as much as we did," I said quietly. Mark smiled, his hand brushing against mine. "Maybe more." As we reached the base of the trail, I realized something profound. Life would always be full of challenges, but facing them together, with honesty, vulnerability, and love, made all the difference. It wasn't just about overcoming the hard moments. It was about appreciating the journey, the people who walked beside you, and the growth that came from every step. And in that, I found a peace I hadn't known before. Life didn't miraculously transform into a perfect story after that hike. There were still challenges, misunderstandings, and moments of frustration. But the difference now was that we had built a foundation of trust and resilience, a shared understanding that we would face whatever came next, together. In the months that followed, my father's health continued to improve. He stuck to his doctor's orders, changed his diet, and even started walking every morning. It was strange, seeing him so determined to take care of himself. For years, I had viewed him as a man set in his ways, unwilling to adapt. But now, it was clear that even he was capable of growth, and that realization deepened my respect for him. One weekend, My father invited Mark and me over for dinner, a simple, home-cooked meal that reminded me of childhood. The air between us was lighter, conversations flowing with a warmth I hadn't felt in years. At one point, my father raised his glass of water and said, "I don't think I've said this enough, but I'm proud of you, Lisa, for everything. And Mark, thank you for taking care of my daughter." Mark looked at me, then back at my dad. "She takes care of me too," he said with a smile. It was a small moment, but it stayed with me. For so long, I had been caught up in my insecurities, my fears of not being enough or being too much. But sitting at that table, surrounded by love and acceptance, I realized I didn't have to carry those fears anymore. Mark and I continued to grow as individuals and as a couple. We started setting goals, not just for our relationship, but for ourselves. Mark pursued a new hobby, woodworking. At first, I thought it was a passing interest, but he quickly proved me wrong, spending hours in the garage crafting furniture and small decorative pieces. "You're really good at this," I told him one evening as he showed me a coffee table he'd just finished. He shrugged, a faint blush creeping up his neck. "It's just nice to create something with my hands, you know. Feels grounding." I understood what he meant. Inspired by his newfound passion, I started revisiting some of my own forgotten hobbies, painting, journaling, even trying yoga. It felt good to pour energy into myself, to nurture my own sense of identity outside of our relationship. One evening, as we sat on the couch, Mark turned to me with a thoughtful expression. "Have you ever thought about writing?" he asked. "Writing, like, as a career?" "No," he said, shaking his head. "More like writing about what you've been through, sharing your story. I think it could help people." The idea took me by surprise. I'd always been a private person, hesitant to share my struggles with anyone outside my inner circle. But the more I thought about it, the more it resonated. "Maybe," I said, the seed of an idea beginning to take root. Over the next few weeks, I began jotting down my thoughts, memories, and reflections about my relationship with Mark, my father, and most importantly, myself. Writing became a way to process everything I'd experienced, to find meaning in the chaos and clarity in the confusion. One day, I showed Mark a draft of something I'd written. It was raw, unpolished, but it was mine. He read it carefully, his expression unreadable. When he finished, he looked up at me, his eyes filled with something I couldn't quite place. "This is beautiful, Lisa," he said. "You have a gift." His words meant more to me than I could say. As I continued writing, I noticed a shift in how I approached life. I was more patient, more present. I started to see challenges not as insurmountable obstacles, but as opportunities for growth. And through it all, Mark remained my biggest supporter, cheering me on every step of the way. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sunset, I turned to him and said, "You know, I've been thinking a lot about what you said, about sharing my story. I think I want to do it. Maybe even turn it into a book." He smiled, a mixture of pride and encouragement in his eyes. "You should. Your story matters, Lisa. And I think a lot of people could learn from it." For the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of purpose, a drive to turn my pain into something meaningful. It wasn't about seeking validation or approval. It was about finding my voice, embracing my journey, and honoring the person I was becoming. And so, I began the next chapter of my life, knowing it would be filled with both challenges and triumphs. But this time I wasn't afraid. I had Mark by my side, a renewed sense of self, and a story worth sharing. Because sometimes, the hardest moments in life are the ones that shape you the most. They break you open, force you to confront your deepest fears, and ultimately lead you to a place of healing and growth. And if there's one thing I've learned, it's that love, Real, honest, messy love is worth fighting for. Every single time. Months turned into a year, and our lives continued to evolve, shaped by the trials and triumphs we had faced. My father's health stabilized, and he even started volunteering at a local community garden, a hobby that brought him unexpected joy. Mark's woodworking blossomed into a small side business, with custom orders rolling in faster than he could keep up. And as for me, I finished the first draft of my book, a deeply personal narrative that felt equal parts terrifying and cathartic to put into words. The day I typed the final sentence, I sat back in my chair and let the emotions wash over me. It wasn't just a book. It was a testament to the journey Mark and I had taken, the lessons learned, and the love that had grown stronger despite the odds. Mark came home that evening to find me staring at my laptop, tears streaming down my face. "Lisa," he said, concern flashing in his eyes as he dropped his bag and came to my side. "What's wrong?" I laughed through the tears, shaking my head. "Nothing's wrong. I finished it. The book." His face broke into a proud smile, and he pulled me into a tight hug. "I'm so proud of you," he said, his voice full of sincerity. "Thank you," I whispered, holding on to him tightly. In the weeks that followed, I began sharing snippets of my story online. To my surprise, people responded. Messages poured in from strangers who said they saw themselves in my words, who felt comforted knowing they weren't alone in their struggles. It was humbling and deeply rewarding to know that my pain could help others heal. One evening, as Mark and I sat together on the couch, I asked him, "Do you think we'll ever forget that night? The fight, you walking out?" He was quiet for a moment, then shook his head. "No, and I don't think we should. It was the moment everything changed, Lisa, for the better." I nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. That night had been the catalyst for everything, the breaking point that forced us to face the truth about ourselves and our relationship. And while it had been painful, it had also been necessary. As the sun set that evening, casting golden hues across the room, I felt a profound sense of peace. Our journey wasn't perfect, but it was ours. And that made it beautiful. To celebrate the completion of my book, we planned a weekend getaway to the same cabin where everything had started. It was a symbolic full circle, a chance to honor how far we'd come. Standing on that familiar hiking trail, overlooking the same breathtaking view, Mark turned to me and said, "You know, I think this place will always be special to us. Not because of what happened here, but because of what it led to." I smiled, my heart full. It's where we found our way back, to each other, and with that, we walked down the trail hand in hand, ready to face whatever life had in store for us next. Because love isn't about never falling. It's about choosing to get back up, again and again, together. If this story moved you, let us know with a like or comment. Share it with someone who might need to hear it. Your support means the world. Thank you for being part of this journey.